Before humanity built temples, wrote scriptures, or gave the divine a name, there was another mystery: death. A person could be alive one day and gone the next. The body remained, but the person seemed to have disappeared. Where does a person go when they die? We cannot hear the thoughts of prehistoric humans. They left us no books explaining what they believed. But they did leave traces. Some prehistoric communities buried their dead deliberately, sometimes placing objects alongside them. These burials do not give us a complete picture of what people believed about death, but they do tell us that death was not always treated as a simple biological event. There was another mystery that may have been just as powerful: dreams. A person could die, disappear from the physical world, and then appear again in a dream. Perhaps the dead could still visit the living. Perhaps the mind was traveling somewhere beyond the body. We cannot know exactly what they thought, but the mystery itself was real. And then there was nature. Thunder, lightning, fire, storms. The movement of the sun and the moon. The return of the seasons. The sudden arrival of drought or flood. Early humans depended completely on forces they could not control. Nature could provide food or destroy an entire community. And when something is powerful, unpredictable, and beyond human control, humans naturally try to understand it. Across ancient societies, we eventually find ideas about spirits, ancestors, sacred places, and supernatural powers. But these ideas were not the same everywhere. There was no single prehistoric religion. Instead, there was something more fundamental. A human attempt to make sense of what could not be seen. Then humanity changed. People began to settle. Agriculture transformed communities. Villages grew. Populations increased. And eventually, cities appeared. With cities came temples. With temples came priests, rituals, offerings, sacred images, and organized religious institutions. Invisible forces became gods. And gods became part of human civilization. To understand the next step in this story, we have to travel to Mesopotamia.
If Chapter 1 was the story of humanity wondering about the unseen, Mesopotamia is where that mystery began to take a recognizable shape. Here, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, some of the world's earliest cities began to rise. This was southern Mesopotamia, the land later known as Sumer. The sacred was becoming organized. The people of Sumer did not imagine the universe as an empty place waiting for one invisible creator. They imagined a world filled with powerful beings. There was An associated with the heavens. Enlil, a powerful god connected with wind, air, and authority. Enki, associated with fresh water, wisdom, and creation. And Inanna, associated with love, sexuality, power, and war. These gods were not simply abstract ideas. They had personalities. They had stories. They could help humans. They could punish them. They could fight with one another. And like humans, they could desire, become angry, make decisions, and change their minds. Each city had its own divine patron. The city was not merely a political community. It was also the earthly home of a god. The great temple stood at the center of this relationship. People brought offerings. Priests performed rituals. And the temple became an economic and political institution as well as a religious one. But why did the ancient world need so many gods?
Mesopotamia was unpredictable. The rivers could bring life. They could also flood without warning. Harvests could succeed or fail. War could arrive suddenly. Disease could appear without explanation. The storm had a power. The river had a power. Fertility had a power. War had a power. Wisdom had a power. And these powers could be given names, personalities, stories, and faces. Nature was no longer simply something that happened. It could be interpreted as something that acted. A storm was not merely weather. It could be connected to a divine will. A disaster could become a punishment. The universe became a story populated by supernatural characters. Then something happened that would change the story forever. humans began to write. Writing eventually allowed myths, prayers, hymns, laws, and stories about the gods to survive beyond a single generation. For the first time, humanity could begin to preserve its ideas about the divine in a durable form. But there was still a deeper question. Were these gods simply different powers of nature? Were they ancestors transformed into divine beings? Were they symbols created by human societies? Or did ancient people believe they were encountering real supernatural beings? The texts can tell us what people said and what they did. They cannot give us scientific proof of what existed beyond the human world.
Far to the west, along another great river, another civilization was developing its own extraordinary vision of the divine. The civilization was Egypt, and its gods were about to build a world beyond death. If Mesopotamia gave the gods a city, ancient Egypt gave them eternity. Along the Nile, one of the world's great civilizations developed a remarkably complex vision of life, death, and the divine. The Nile was the center of Egyptian civilization. Every year, its waters could transform the surrounding land, bringing fertile soil to a landscape otherwise dominated by desert. Life depended on the river. And perhaps it was no coincidence that Egyptian ideas about death were so deeply connected with renewal. Egyptian religion was not centered on one single conception of God. Instead, it contained a vast and changing family of gods and goddesses. Ra was associated with the sun. Osiris became the great god of the dead and the afterlife. Isis was associated with motherhood, magic, and protection. Horus was connected with kingship and the sky. Anubis was associated with funerary rituals and the dead. But one story became particularly powerful: the story of Osiris. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was murdered by his brother Seth. His body was dismembered and scattered. But Isis searched for him, recovered his remains, and through her power, Osiris was restored to a form of life beyond ordinary human existence. Osiris became ruler of the dead. Death did not necessarily have to be the end. Egyptians imagined death as a transition.
The dead entered another realm, where their fate depended on the condition of their soul and their relationship with divine order. The heart of the deceased was placed on a scale against the feather associated with Ma'at. Ma'at represented truth, balance, and cosmic order. Death had become a moral question. The Egyptians called it Ma'at. It represented truth, justice, balance, and the proper order of the universe. The king was expected to maintain Ma'at on earth. The gods maintained it in the cosmos. And human beings were expected to live within it. The Egyptian king was not simply a political ruler. Kingship itself had a sacred dimension.
The pharaoh was associated with Horus during life and with Osiris after death. This gave political authority a divine meaning. Egyptians built tombs, preserved bodies, prepared offerings, and created elaborate funerary texts. The pyramids remain the most spectacular monuments of this worldview. They were expressions of a civilization obsessed with permanence. Stone was being used to resist time itself. What happens after we die? The Egyptians did not answer that question with a single simple doctrine. They created an entire universe around it, a universe in which death could lead to judgment, transformation, and continued existence. The divine was no longer simply something that controlled the storm or protected the city. It had become connected to morality, kingship, the structure of the universe, and the fate of the individual soul. Far to the east, on the Indian subcontinent, religious thought was moving in a very different direction. The question would gradually change, not only which god rules the universe, but something far more radical. What is ultimate reality itself?